we will now call the Diversion Authority Land Management Committee of Wednesday, November 20th, 2019 to order. Thank you. Why don't we go around the room and just say who's here. Mary Sherling.
Joel Paulson, Executive Director.
Eric Dodds with AE2S.
Kevin Campbell, Clay County Commission.
Bruce Grubb, Fargo City Administrator.
Nathan Borboom, City of Fargo Engineering.
Bob Zimmerman, Moorhead City Engineer.
Shelley Byron, Secretary.
Corey Peterson, Mayor of Forest.
Dwayne Breitling, Cass County Commission.
Jack Henningsen, Ward City Council.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You have the agenda in front of you. Do you have any additions or changes to that agenda? If not, a motion to approve?
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. And the minutes, any additions or corrections to the minutes? Or motion to approve?
Approval.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. And moving on to item number 4, property acquisition status report, which is item B in your packet, pages 12 through 21. Eric, do you want to talk about that?
Sure do. I would say this is the usual report that you've seen many times in the past. I'll point out a few different things just for your awareness as well. On page 13, you'll note, if you recall from last month, we were just shy of 330 parcels. Now we're at this report's production anyway at 330 parcels that have been acquired. Since that time, I know we've had a few additional that have closed, and so we continue to add a handful of parcels each month, continuing to make some progress. The rest of them you can see, I guess, the various stages. There are a handful of parcels up on the north end of the channel that are shaded purple, which means we have purchase agreements signed and we're working to establish closing dates on those. But still, by and large, the bulk of the parcels on the channel south of 94 are shaded blue, which means we're continuing to be in negotiations. We have a growing number of those that are starting what's called formal negotiations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the agenda. Generally, you get a sense here of where we're going and where things are at. The remaining pages in this report are fairly typical with what we've seen in the past few months, but I would draw your attention to page 18. You'll note that we have now split the southern embankment into 6 different parts. Previously, that was all lumped into one category. Now it is 6 parts, so they're SE 1 through 5, and then also the I-29 road raise project make up the 6 different parts. And you'll also notice that SE 4 and SE 5 are in Minnesota, and the remaining 4 parts are in North Dakota. So you generally get a flavor of how that breaks down by state. On SE1, you'll see that those appraisals are pending. We have an appraiser under contract. He's expecting to get all of those appraisal reports done by the end of the year, and so we're on schedule to meet the Corps' timeframe for getting the lands acquired on that project. And then just to draw your attention on SE2, you see a bunch of green boxes. In fact, we have acquired a few properties under the SE2. That's the Camel Hump area. We've acquired some of those parcels through early voluntary sales, and that's, I guess, it was one large parcel that was actually subdivided into a bunch of parts, and so that's why we're taking credit for a bunch of acquisitions. In all reality, it was one closing.
So do we have a map that shows what those are?
Yep, so if you go back to page 12, that gives you a summary of where the southern embankment is. The segments or reaches are not shown on here, but I can explain that and maybe add that for next month. Okay. Basically starts on the west side is reach 1, and so that zigzagged portion that goes from the end of the zigzag up to the diversion inlet structure is reach 1. And then reach 2 is the Camel Hump area, so between the inlet and the wild race control structure. Reach 3 is between the Wild Rice structure and the Red River structure. Reach 4 is the north-south segment in Minnesota, and Reach 5 is the east-west segment in Minnesota.
I think that would be
Sure.
helpful just to have those labeled in some
I
fashion.
know it by heart, but I realize not everyone.
Thank you.
I would also draw your attention to pages 19 and 20. Similarly to the southern embankment, we have now split out the upstream mitigation area into the parcels in Minnesota on page 19, and on page 20, the parcels in North Dakota. And so you can see the approximate parcel counts there. These are labeled as approximate. We're still working with the permitting agencies to firm up the exact mitigation boundaries and waiting for the final approval of the Clomer model. I anticipate that these parcel counts may drop a little bit as we get through that process, but that's still kind of working through the process. So those were the points I wanted to address on that report, and happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Questions? And so far, we're all on budget with all of these.
Yeah, I know there was some questions, I can't remember if they came from this group or maybe the board last meeting, but there were some questions about, we've been purchasing excess property in some locations, and generally that's been a real useful tool for our lands program. If a property owner wants to sell more than what we need, and he's willing to do it in a voluntary fashion, we've generally been agreeable to that, provided that we're not asked to buy 400 acres when we only need 10 or something. But there's obviously a budget question in that equation as well. And so if we're buying more land than what we need and we budgeted for what we need, do we have a budget buster type situation? So we're reviewing that right now. I anticipate having some more analysis on that here in the coming weeks. My gut feel, hopefully I don't jinx this, but my gut feel is that we're still within our budget. We budgeted for, estimated prices, and I feel like the appraisals and the negotiations have still been within that budget, even with the handful of additional acres that we've been purchasing. So, but more to come on that question.
And what about timing? Are we on schedule for what we need to do, and especially in the channel?
Yes, we are on schedule. Again, the deadline for having the lands acquired for the channel is September 1st for parcels with structures, and October 15th for parcels that are just land. I believe we are on schedule for that. As I mentioned earlier, we have a growing number of parcels that are starting to step into the formal negotiation process. And there are some sort of timelines with that recipe that we're following. I believe we have sufficient time to get through all those steps and still meet those deadlines. So feel pretty comfortable about it.
And that was pushed back because originally we were hoping for June.
Originally, I think we were looking more at spring timeframe, and that would have been probably a big push. So,
Okay, great. Any questions or comments? Then item 5, you can talk about the voluntary sale of property and acquisition program.
Last month, we met and we were on the sort of the doorstep of an auction that we became aware of in the upstream mitigation area. And there was lots of good debate at the outreach committee, at this committee, and ultimately at the board meeting last month about should we or shouldn't we engage in an auction. And I think there's pros and cons to both sides of that. But the sort of action or the request from the board was, well, why don't we firm up our policy? We kind of had maybe half or a quarter of a policy related to buying land at an auction. And so wanted to spend a little bit of time working on that. So in front of you on page 22 is a red line of the somewhat related policy that was in the mitigation plan. And then on page 23 is just a clean version of the red lines. So this was developed, I know we talked a little bit about it with a few of you. Joel and I talked a little bit about this and wanted to be responsive to the request for having a policy on purchasing land from sellers who are, actively trying to sell their property. If they, previously, the policy was limited to people who reached out directly to the project. And we've modified this a little bit to include property owners who are choosing to sell their property via public sale, whether that's, listed for sale or whether that's an auction or some other way that they're choosing to sell their property. And if it's property that we need for the project in some fashion, whether that's fee title or easements, our recommendation is that the Diversion Authority has assigned the role of acquiring property rights in North Dakota to the Cass County Joint Board and assigned that role to the MCCJPA Board in Minnesota. And so our recommendation is that the Diversion Authority sort of embrace that philosophy of divvying up the responsibility for buying land. The PMC will work with those acquiring entities as well as the executive director to develop a recommendation for them. And the recommendation on whether we should or shouldn't be a buyer would be based on a variety of factors, such as what property rights do we need for the project, whether that's, we need fee title, we need an easement, something else. The location of the property, is the property needed for construction? Is it needed for operations? Is it the deeper portion of the pool? Is it in the shallow portion of the pool? All of those things could be variable. The timing of the property rights, if it's something that we know is not needed for 5 years from now, then maybe we have less of an interest. If it's something that we know we need within a year or two, then maybe we should be more active. And then the type of property, whether there's structures there, whether it's just farmland, whether there's a potential building site or some sort of development potential, we just as soon purchase it before somebody goes and builds a home in an area that we need to then buy out the home. And so those are some of the factors that would be considered as the recommendations would be developed and presented to that acquiring entity group. So that was kind of the framework. I'm happy to massage that, take questions. I guess ultimately what I was hoping is we have a good discussion here, and then we might be able to, if you're willing, refer this or recommend this to the diversion board tomorrow.
Talked at all to public outreach about getting this message out to landowners?
You'll notice on the first bullet point on here that that we've committed to periodically notifying impacted property owners, and in that notification, making sure that they're aware that we would have this program available. That notification step was included in the earlier versions of this policy, and we have done some notifications to property owners, remember, back in February and then again recently in October. And so I think that was developed, maybe not with the committee's input, but I know that Rocky and the outreach committee have had some discussions. Joel, maybe you as well had some discussions about outreach to the property owners, and obviously the outreach work and the lands work is sort of joined at the hip in this regards.
My concern would be if they're not aware and then they engage a realtor or an auction, agency, and then they've got a contract and they need to pay that person, and obviously we would want to be the first person in line to acquire the property, and we've already got a bump in the road, so. Kevin?
Yeah, Mary, you bring up a really good point there, and I think that, for example, now the MCCJPA just sent out a letter for certain properties regarding rights of entry issues. When we get into further contacts with them, and I know we're waiting for some we haven't really got that area defined yet because of working with the regulatory, as you mentioned. But when we have that, I think it would be appropriate for us to, at that time, we'll send something out to everybody. I think that's the intentions of that. And including that, I think would be, we should have this portion. And I don't know how we could get that sooner, to those people who, for example, I just got a call last week from somebody who's a willing seller or is interested in, on the Minnesota side, and he's in an area that we need the property. I forwarded him to Eric, but how many more of those might there be between now and when we can reach them? So I don't know. You raise a really good point, and what is the answer?
Well, I mean, I think we have to just continually be in contact with these people. I know we're waiting for the Clomer to come through, and because the fringe areas we're not completely sure about, but you know, the other thing too maybe we need to be engaging the Realtors Association and the auction houses and make sure that they're aware that if, you know, if they're engaged in talking to an owner in this area, that should be a red flag. They don't have to know all the details, but that should just be a red flag. I'm gonna go check this out. Contact Eric or Joel or somebody and have a discussion. I mean, I had a realtor contact me not long ago about some, you know, land on the fringe, and you know, people just want to have information and before they start selling property and then they found out that they can't build in it or something. So that might be a really good group to start with, just so they're aware.
But I think these are, you know, good ideas. I feel like we've, you know, we have done some mailings to property owners. There's always room for more, but keep in mind, we've also heard feedback from some of our land agents who are visiting with property owners, you know, at their kitchen tables. And some of the property owners have said, why are you sending me all this stuff? It's information overload. And so I don't know if that means we've hit it just right, where, you know, too much, too little, Goldilocks, I don't know, but I think your point is valid, that we want to make sure people are aware of what's happening.
Well, in the last auction, they didn't know, so, you know, that we would have to put in a flowage easement on that. So I just think that that's something we should, that's a pretty minimal, easy thing to do. I mean, the Realtors Association can just send out a blasting email to everybody. We don't have to make a big thing of it, but just get that information out to people.
I was just gonna mention to Eric too, that I think it's fine for the information overload, to be honest with you, because then nobody's gonna come back and say they didn't know. I mean, that's just willful ignorance otherwise, but I'd rather have them get inundated than not.
I would agree.
There's just a suggestion on item number C here on page 22. As I look at this, you know, we have the red line version says voluntary sale of property and acquisition program, and and if we're trying to establish a policy on how we're going to deal with those types of properties, I'm wondering if we shouldn't reword that to say acquisition program for voluntary sale of property. Just kind of turn that around a little bit, so it's, I think it makes a little more sense that way.
Sure.
And what about the easements? You know, when the land trades hands, how are we making sure that people understand there's going to be an easement put on this property?
Well, again, you know, we've done some of those direct mailings, and so people, if they read them anyway, they should be aware. We did that disclosure to the recent auction sale. And so I feel like we've done some of those parts. You know, many people, if you're not familiar with the project, you're living under a rock or something. Don't put that in minutes, but you know, otherwise, I think generally it's the buyer's responsibility to be an educated buyer. I know when I met with Max Steffes, he was very clear that, you know, they try to disclose as much information as they can and sort of over-disclose, but he also commented that the buyer has a responsibility to be educated, and so unfortunately that's maybe falls on the buyer's shoulders.
I think that there might be some challenge there, and that the seller has a responsibility to disclose what they know about the impacted property. And of course, Minnesota real estate laws are different than North Dakota's, but there's some real responsibility there on the seller's part. So, you know, and I think we want to make sure that they're getting the information they need so they can disclose it.
I think that's probably something too, when you're talking about auction houses and things like that, that they're aware that those properties could have easements on them too, so they're aware before it all gets that far along, and they can make that announcement during the.
I mean, they should be
auction.
calling you. You shouldn't have had to call them.
Right.
You know, I mean, I would think, but
But maybe they just need to be aware of it, that that's something when you get into this situation that they should probably double check too, so that there's.
You know, obviously, there's a lot of attention on this because of the recent auction, and rightfully so. I think in the last, I don't know, 8 years, I'm not aware of another auction in our upstream area. And so, while this is critically important, I think we probably need to keep it a bit in context as well. That being said, I know there has been other lands that have sold, but not necessarily auctions.
the other issue that we're having in the county right now, and not necessarily in this area, but outside of the protected area, is, you know, in North Dakota, the counties don't have zoning privileges. That's the township. People will go to their township and they'll get their blessing to go build something, and they will have neglected to come to the county planning department to make sure that they've got everything situated there. And, you know, the last one, they're very disappointed property owners. I mean, Jason says, well, you know, the road's underwater every spring or whatever. I mean, you can't build there. So I would make sure that we're reaching out to those affected townships. I mean, they should know, but, you know, it's Pleasant and Stanley. But making sure that if somebody wants to get a building permit and subdivide some land, you know, that they understand that it might not work out so well.
I know that Jason has been in contact with many of them, and he's obviously very familiar with the permitting officials with these townships, but that's a good note. I can follow up with Jason on that.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Sure.
There's also a thought here as well that potentially we could reach out to the township officials responsible for zoning and do a workshop for them. You know, kind of the same idea of the biogeo easement meetings where we tried to get all the landowners to come to a single location, do a presentation, and then engage with them in the attempt to achieve the biogeo easements. That might be a possibility. We could do a workshop for the township officials, get the information out, make some recommendations on how they should administer their zoning in relation to the diversion project and the impacts that it might cause, so.
And would that apply to like Reed Township and up north there too, I would think?
Yeah, any township that has impacts, property right impacts from this project, you know, should be included in that. And that way might be the most efficient way of outreach to those folks.
And you might want to reach out to our county planner.
Sure.
Who is now the City of Horace planner, but used to be a City of Fargo planner, but so we're in the process of acquiring a new one, but
Sure.
But that would probably be a good spot to engage that person.
Definitely.
I think Barrett's with the county through this end of this week, so we'll see if we can get that.
Okay, anything else on that? I think that's great.
If I can just ask one
Sure,
more
Kevin.
question regarding page 22 and the proposal that we have before us, the very last bullet point that's in black. Eric, could you explain that to me?
Yeah. So if a property owner is reaching out to us, generally voluntary in nature, of course, if they're willing to sell. What this is pointing out is that because it might be, 4 or 5 years down the road, or perhaps the property owner might be selling something that we think we're gonna need, but we don't necessarily have a final design yet. And so if we would start down the process of, say, we do an appraisal and the negotiations go awry during negotiating, we might not be in a situation where we would sort of force the sale to happen. This is intended to be a voluntary program. And so I just want to be clear with everybody, I guess, that if we start down.
I guess I just didn't understand the terminology here where it says not be able to demonstrate necessity if negotiations are unsuccessful.
Yeah. And so basically what that means, if we're gonna come to it, if you approach me and you say, I'd like to consider selling my property, I say, okay, that's great, I think we need your property. We start evaluation, we do an appraisal or maybe get evaluation done. We present that offer to you, we negotiate back and forth. If we can't reach terms, if you asking for 10 times my number, for example, I'm not gonna turn around and say, well, I'm gonna use court to force the sale of your property with this valuation. We would wait until we had a firm design and then start the, sort of formal, planned acquisition process.
Well, I like the way you described it. I just don't know if that's what it says.
Yeah, it is,
Yeah.
it is, it needs a little work.
Yeah. I like the way
It's a little
you
wordsy.
described it is good, but I don't think that's what it necessarily says.
So these early acquisitions may be considered voluntary because the acquiring entity may not be able to demonstrate necessity if negotiations are unsuccessful.
Need 2 sentences. If negotiations are unsuccessful, then
No further action will be taken to acquire the property.
Yeah, I think that would help.
The thing,
I guess
negotiations will cease. or-
but that may not be the case, though. I mean, if we can't negotiate voluntarily and we already have a design at that point, we might be in a position to proceed.
But you gotta remember what we're under, on this particular topic, what we're under here is acquisition program for sale of voluntary property. So we don't even want, we shouldn't get into alternatives there. That's what I'm, I think we can scare people with.
I would suggest you probably could delete that whole bullet.
Sure.
Because of what Kevin just said, it's voluntary all over the page.
Yeah.
And so why even reference
don't
forced?
indicate otherwise.
I like that. Does that clarify it?
Yeah, that makes it better. Cause I think we covered it without that.
Yeah.
That's why we have the doctor here.
It's a good point, Mr. Zimmerman. I'd like to just add, I worked with Eric on this, in the language, and I believe it's flexible enough to allow us to consider unintended consequences in scenarios where we may need to do something a little bit different, but it also provides assurances and an intent to certain circumstances. And I think that's where there were issues with the land auction, is that we really didn't have anything that indicated our approach to it. And so other landowners who were interested in purchasing those properties for agricultural purposes really had quite a bit of concern. So this language change, I think, clarifies that, but still allows us flexibility for specific situations as they may arise.
Well, with that, Chair, I would move that we recommend to the Diversion Authority that we recommend approval of the acquisition program for voluntary sale of property. And I say that with the terminology changed, and then with also then the acquisition process should be listed the same way, where the acquisition process for voluntary sale of property, and then the elimination of the last bullet point. That's my motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? So you'll make those changes before the board meeting?
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking is I'd make these edits, probably have an updated red line version and an updated clean version that we can lay down in front of the board tomorrow, and it'll be from the land committee.
All right, any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay. Formal negotiations update, how's it going?
Yeah, I definitely wanted, I think this was on our agenda last month, and probably want to keep giving this committee an update on a regular basis. As you heard me explain, we have a number of properties that have, well, the Cass County Joint Board has authorized us to start formal negotiations on I believe it's almost 60 different properties. And so when we start formal negotiations, that's probably step 4 in a 12-step process. And the start of formal negotiations includes sending a letter to the property owner, attaching the appraisal, attaching a purchase agreement, and it explains that we are once again offering to buy the property that's needed for the appraised amount, which may in some situations be less than what has already been negotiated informally. But it's a requirement in the process. We are very much following the statutes established in North Dakota. This letter is not intended to be threatening, but there are some prescriptive language that our attorneys have advised we need to include in these letters. And I would be surprised if some property owners were not upset with the letters. And so given that there's a growing number of these, not all 60 have gone out. I think we've only sent out maybe a 10 or thereabouts. But they're starting to land in mailboxes, and so wanted this committee to be certainly aware of that, and our land agents, who are the people meeting with these property owners, are letting them know that this process is happening, and this is, you know, sort of what's going to be happening next. However, the statutes in North Dakota prohibit them from even referencing quick take eminent domain, and so it really is, it's kind of a goofy statute where it really puts our land agents and the joint board in kind of an awkward situation where we can't mention quick take. However, we are very much having to follow this recipe, this quick take recipe, to meet the timelines that are needed for the project. So anyway, I guess I just wanted to make sure to share that information with this group. The Cass County Joint Board is, you know, well aware. They're authorizing the start of formal negotiations. I think they're fairly steadfast in their role and responsibility on this project to get the land acquired, and we're, you know, trying to do that in as, you know, professional way as we can.
So is there any kind of a stumbling block as far as the timing? I mean, are they actively negotiating back and forth, and then, you know, somebody had to be out of town for a week, or you needed to check with all the siblings, and then boom, we've got a timeline, so we got to get a letter out?
In the channel situation, we have enough time where those things are generally avoided. Now, every negotiation is unique. You can imagine that. So in some situations, we have property owners who are actively communicating, we're actively negotiating with them, and we're telling them, you know, look, we have this timeline to adhere to, so you're going to get this letter, but let's keep negotiating. And I think generally people understand that. In other situations, you've got a property owner who says, don't talk to me at all, just send it all to my attorney, and we'll go through the court process, and they're totally fine with that. And of course, there's a bunch kind of in the middle. So I feel like on the channel, we're doing what we can. You mentioned multiple property owners. That's one of the, you know, issues that we're having to address as well. The statute makes sure that it requires us to send these letters to all of the property owners. You know, if there's remainderment or other things that have some ownership interests, we got to track all those down. And so there's ownership and encumbrance reports that are being developed for all the properties, and you know, some of them have multiple property owners, and so multiple letters and appraisers go out. So it's quite the process. So.
Just a reminder to everybody that this is a new statute in North Dakota. So we're trying it probably more than anybody else. So we're kind of the guinea pigs with this. It probably will get changed down the road somewhere. But okay, Cass County Joint Water Resource District.
I think I might have to just clarify something if I
Sure.
can regarding just the previous
Sure.
motion that I made. And, because if you go back to page 22, if you look at the bottom, it says page 42 of 115. So the motion that's going to the DA should be to modify that portion of our mitigation plan to the text, proposed text. I don't know if I made that clear, but we're actually making a modification to a policy we already have.
Correct. Yeah.
It's not an additional policy.
Right,
It's a
right,
modification. And is everybody in agreement with that?
Wanted to make that clarification.
Okay. So I think you've kind of given the Cass County update, more or less.
Yeah, I think so.
Is anything else to add?
See, Dan just walked in, but I think they have we met in November, and we've got one meeting coming up in December, and so they're continuing to stay pretty busy. We've got a pretty healthy packet for them every month.
Okay. Did you have anything else to add to that, Dan? Okay. And then Kevin, you want to talk about the
Well, we don't meet until tomorrow, but we did have, Eric was at our board meeting on Tuesday, and we talked a little bit about Clay County, we talked a little bit about the process for easements and how that works for properties who are non-willing participants that we need to have. And our county board made a motion to send back to the MCC JPA, which will be tomorrow, that the MCC JPA hire Onstead Twitchell to handle all the legalities of those processes. It's the same that the Cass County Joint Powers, or Cass County Joint Resource District uses. And so we kind of wanted to be consistent, and quite frankly, our county attorney's office is kind of overloaded with work. So that's our board's position that we sent tomorrow. So hopefully at 1:30 tomorrow, they'll agree to that. And then that process will just follow the Clay County as the fiscal host, so we would make those payments to Onstead and then submit those. MCC JPA would submit those costs back to the Diversion Authority for reimbursement. So that's the update I have.
MetroCog update. I don't see anybody here. Oh,
Yep.
There we go. Yes, come and join us. Tell us what you got going on. Yeah, you bet.
I have just a very quick update. We're still on track with our accelerated timeline to analyze and develop recreational components here. We had a meeting with our study review committee last week for our recreation plan. Again, this committee is made up of city, county, park district staff, as well as members from the Diversion Authority. We reviewed some of the warmer weather and winter recreation features that we talked about the last land management committee. Our SRC didn't have a lot of comments on those, so we are taking some of these components and assisting with some design guidelines and language for Jacobs to be incorporated into base and alternate bids. So that's pretty much all I have.
Have you gotten much public feedback?
Again, the features that we've developed is based on the public input that we received back in August and September when we had several pop-up meetings and public input meeting. So, yeah.
Questions? Yes, Chuck.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With the MetroCog update, because they're going to be an integral part of the Effingham diversion, are we going to have a standing agenda item for MetroCog in the land committee?
I believe so, that was the plan,
Okay.
yeah.
Because I talked about it at MetroCog and I forgot about it, so I apologize. But yeah, it'd be good for them to speak every week, not
Yeah.
every week, but every month about ongoing activities with MetroCog, so.
We had discussed, you know, this committee's makeup and the difficulty with changing committee makeups just because of our JPA is pretty prescribed on how we do that. But having technical input here is always welcome, and so we would like them to be here just to keep us apprised of what's going on with that.
Sure, and if they don't have any, you just be like the business with the diversion, so.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Anyone else have any questions on the recreational plan? I think, you know, I'm excited about that part of it. I think it's, we kind of, when we don't have a flood, we forget about what a flood's like. And, you know, this project will be used in some fashion some years, but to always be able to use the recreational components of it in such a flat area that is, I think, in dire need of some recreation, especially close to the metro area. You know, when we talk about, you know, how you urban planning and green space and all of that, to be able to just pedal your bicycle a couple miles and have this area, and then potentially maybe have a state park or an interpretive center. I think it appeals to a broad variety of people, so I think it's pretty cool. Any other business? If not, then I'll accept a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
We are adjourned.